Civilizations do not simply vanish. Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, a world came crashing down. The mighty Hittite Empire dissolved. The opulent palaces of Mycenaean Greece were abandoned. The great trading cities of the Levant burned. For centuries, historians saw this as a mystery, a dark age brought by war or natural disaster. But the true story is far more unsettling. This was not a single catastrophe. It was a complex systems failure, a domino effect of economic collapse. This video will reveal how the first globalized world order was destroyed by the cascading failure of its own supply chains. You will understand how a drought in one region could starve an empire, how a pirate raid on a single port could halt the flow of a vital metal, and how the entire interconnected system of the Bronze Age unraveled link by link. What does it take for a network of nations, bound by trade and diplomacy, to completely disintegrate? To understand how this collapse could spread, you first need to grasp the world that existed before the fall. This was not a collection of isolated kingdoms. By the 13th century before the Common Era, the lands from Greece to Egypt and from Mesopotamia to the Aegean were woven into the first truly international system. Think of it as a kind of ancient global economy, a delicate web of alliances, treaties, and trade routes that stretched for thousands of miles. The evidence for this interconnected world is not just theory, it is physical, pulled from the depths of the sea. In the 1980s, off the coast of Turkey, archaeologists discovered a shipwreck near a place called. This single merchant vessel, dating to around 1300 before the Common Era, was a floating snapshot of this global network. Its cargo hold was a marvel. It contained 10 tons of raw copper ingots from the island of Cyprus. It carried precious tin, likely sourced from faraway Afghanistan. There was ebony wood from Africa, ivory from elephant tusks, glass ingots from Mesopotamia, and amber from the Baltic Sea. This one ship was a microcosm of an entire economic order, carrying the vital raw materials that powered empires. This system was held together by more than just merchants. At the highest levels, kings and pharaohs engaged in constant diplomacy, cementing relationships through extravagant gift exchanges. We know this from a remarkable archive of clay tablets found in Egypt, the diplomatic correspondence of Pharaoh Akhenaten. These letters reveal a world of royal niceties and stark demands. A Hittite king might write to the pharaoh, "My brother, please send me a shipment of gold, for gold is as common as dust in your land. In return, I will send you fine horses and chariots." It was a formalized, almost ritualized system of trade between royal courts, ensuring a steady flow of prestige goods and, more importantly, critical commodities. Every region had a specialized role, a monopoly on something the entire system needed. The island of Cyprus was not just a source of copper, it was the copper source, its very name giving us the Latin word for the metal. The tin needed to alloy with copper to create bronze was even rarer, traveling overland from distant Afghanistan, or perhaps even from as far west as Cornwall in Britain. Egypt served as the breadbasket of the eastern Mediterranean, its fertile Nile delta producing grain surpluses that could feed other regions in lean times. Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, was a key supplier of silver and the early knowledge of iron working. This was a world of profound interdependence. No single kingdom produced everything it needed to thrive. Their wealth, their military power, and their very stability relied on the smooth, uninterrupted function of this complex web. It was a brilliant system, a pinnacle of early civilization, but it was also a system built on a house of cards. The very connections that created its golden age made it uniquely vulnerable. When one card began to wobble, the stability of every connected kingdom was suddenly in question. The entire brilliant structure of this world rested on a single, astonishingly rare material. Bronze, the metal that gave the age its name, was not one element but two. Copper was plentiful, but to transform it into the hard, durable alloy that made weapons, tools, and art, you needed tin. And tin was the keystone. Without it, copper was just soft metal. With it, you had civilization itself. The problem was that tin deposits were extraordinarily scarce. They existed in only a handful of far-flung corners of the known world. The most significant source was likely thousands of miles to the east, in the remote mountains of what is now Afghanistan. Another possible source lay in the opposite direction, all the way in the British Isles. This meant that the lifeblood of every army, every artisan's workshop, every royal treasury originated in a place almost no one in the palaces of Greece or Anatolia had ever seen. Think about the journey. A lump of tin ore mined in a Central Asian valley would be packed onto donkeys for a treacherous overland trek to the Persian Gulf. There, it would be loaded onto a ship, sail up the rivers of Mesopotamia, be traded, repacked, and then carried by merchants across Syria, perhaps onto another ship bound for Cyprus to meet its copper partner, and finally distributed to kingdoms across the Mediterranean. This was not a robust supply chain. It was a thin, fragile thread stretched across continents and seas. A single mountain pass closed by conflict, a caravan raided by bandits, a port blockaded by pirates, or a trading partner who decided to hoard their supply. Any one of these interruptions could sever that thread entirely. The entire metallurgical economy, and therefore the military and economic power of every major state, was perpetually one disruption away from crisis. This was the fundamental vulnerability baked into the splendor of the Bronze Age. Its greatest strength, its deep specialization and interdependence, was also its greatest weakness. Every link in that long chain had to hold. While tin was the rare spice, copper was the hardy grain that fed the entire system. And for the kingdoms of the Bronze Age, there was one primary breadbasket. The island of Cyprus, known to them as, was not just a source of copper, it was the source. The very geography of the island seemed designed for this purpose, with great ore-rich mountains rising from the sea, veins of green and blue stone waiting to be transformed. The scale of production was staggering. Ancient mines, like those were industrial hubs, with networks of shafts and galleries extending deep into the earth. Furnaces dotted the landscape, their fires burning day and night to smelt the raw ore into the iconic oxhide-shaped ingots, bars of pure metal that became the standard currency of international trade. To hold one of these ingots was to hold a piece of wealth, a tangible piece of power. This copper was the indispensable counterpart to the distant tin. Without Cyprus, the Bronze Age literally could not happen. The entire metallurgical heartbeat of the Eastern Mediterranean depended on the regular, rhythmic pulse of ships leaving Cypriot harbors, their hulls heavy with this crucial cargo. Control of this island, or at least an unbroken alliance with its rulers, was therefore not merely an economic advantage. It was a strategic imperative. The Hittite Empire to the north constantly jockeyed for influence over, understanding that whoever commanded its copper commanded the means to equip armies. The great palaces of Mycenaean Greece structured their trade networks to ensure a direct line to Cypriot ports. The city-states of the Levant, like Ugarit, flourished as middlemen, redistributing Cypriot copper inland. So you begin to see the true nature of this interconnected world. It was not a collection of equal partners. It was a pyramid, and Cyprus sat very near its foundation. A political upheaval on the island, a rebellion that disrupted the mines, would send immediate shockwaves. A natural event, like an earthquake damaging the port facilities, would delay shipments for months. Most dangerously, piracy or naval conflict in the surrounding seas could strangle this vital artery entirely. The prosperity of empires thousands of miles away was inextricably linked to the stability of a single, mountainous island. This created a world of immense fragility, where a crisis in one specialized corner could starve the entire network of its most basic physical need. But alongside the raw materials of power, a parallel economy of pure prestige flowed through the very same channels. This was a trade not in copper or grain, but in splendor. In the royal courts of the Bronze Age, power was not just held, it was performed, and the stage was set with breathtaking luxury goods. From the workshops of Mesopotamia came a substance that seemed like captured magic: glass. Artisans there had mastered a complex process, mixing silica from river sand with plant ash and mineral colorants, then firing it at incredibly high temperatures to create vibrant ingots of cobalt blue, lapis lazuli, and translucent white. These glass ingots, found on ships like the one at, were not final products. They were raw artistic potential, shipped across the sea to be reheated and crafted into exquisite beads, vessels, and inlays for palaces and temples. Possessing such objects spoke of a king's reach, his ability to command the talents of distant masters and the wonders of far-off lands. From the interior of Africa came materials of a different kind of majesty, ivory and ebony. Elephant tusks, carefully carved into ornate cosmetic boxes, furniture inlays, and delicate figurines, represented a control over vast, untamed continents. The dense, jet-black heartwood of the ebony tree, laboriously transported north, was polished into furniture fit only for a god-king. These materials spoke of a dominion over nature itself, transforming the raw bounty of the earth into symbols of civilized refinement. And flowing from the south, from the land of Nubia, was the ultimate symbol of divine favor, gold. Egyptian pharaohs famously called it the flesh of the gods. Nubian mines produced a steady stream of this incorruptible metal, which was then hammered into death masks, shaped into jewelry, and lavished upon loyal allies as the highest mark of honor. A gift of gold from the pharaoh was not a simple transaction. It was a political bond cast in metal, a tangible affirmation of brotherhood and mutual obligation between rulers. This entire economy of glass, ivory, and gold served a purpose far beyond decoration. It was the grease that kept the diplomatic machinery running smoothly. The regular exchange of these extravagant gifts reaffirmed alliances, settled disputes, and proved continued goodwill. When a Hittite king received a shipment of Nubian gold and Mesopotamian glass from Egypt, it was a message written in treasure. It said, "Our relationship is strong. The trade routes are open. The world is as it should be." Therefore, the sudden interruption of this luxury trade was not merely a loss of beautiful things. It was a deafening silence in the conversation of kings. If gifts ceased, it signaled a rupture. It meant trust had evaporated, that the old bonds of brotherhood were broken, and that the delicate web of alliances holding the international order together was beginning to fray. The collapse would start not with a bang, but with a chilling absence of glittering gifts. Yet for all its complexity, this glittering network rested on a foundation of something far more basic: food. The entire superstructure of royal diplomacy and long-distance trade depended on the ability of ordinary farmers to reliably feed their cities, their port workers, and their armies. And around the year 1200 before the Common Era, that foundation began to crack. We now know this not from ancient chronicles, but from the silent testimony of trees and lake beds. Paleoclimatologists, scientists who study ancient weather patterns, have uncovered a stark and unsettling picture. By examining the growth rings of ancient juniper trees from the highlands of Anatolia, they can read a year-by-year diary of rainfall. The rings from this period tell a story of prolonged thirst. They become desperately narrow, indicating season after season of inadequate rain. This same story is written in the mud at the bottom of the Dead Sea. Sediment cores pulled from its depths show layers of fine dust, blown in during extended dry periods when the surrounding landscape simply withered. The evidence points to a decade mega-drought, a profound climatic shift that settled over the eastern Mediterranean like a heavy, silent blanket. This was not a single bad harvest. This was a systemic, grinding environmental change that redefined what was possible for agriculture across the entire region. The consequences were immediate and brutal for societies built on surplus. Crop yields plummeted. Herds of livestock dwindled for lack of pasture. The margins of farmland shrank back, and the specter of scarcity became a constant companion. For the great empires, this presented an existential logistical crisis. Their populations, especially in urban centers and palace complexes, had grown dependent on grain shipped from fertile regions. The Hittite Empire in central Anatolia, with its rocky plateau, was particularly vulnerable. Historical records from the Hittite capital of show they had long relied on emergency grain imports from their southern allies, most critically from the fertile Nile Delta of Egypt. A surviving letter from a Hittite king to an Egyptian pharaoh makes a pleading, almost desperate request for a shipment of grain to stave off famine. This was the supply chain under its most fundamental stress. When the climate turned, Egypt's own surpluses may have shrunk, making such life-saving shipments politically harder to justify and logistically more difficult to fulfill. The intricate web of trade, once flowing with copper, tin, and gold, now had to carry an urgent, heavier cargo, the very sustenance of nations. A drought in Anatolia could therefore trigger a diplomatic crisis with Egypt. A poor harvest in Greece could force a kingdom to withhold its shipments of olive oil or pottery, goods promised in exchange for vital grain from elsewhere. The climatic trigger did not attack palaces with fire or armies with swords. It attacked the root of the system, slowly leaching resilience from every link in the chain. It turned abundance into calculation and cooperation into a tense struggle for survival. The first domino had been tipped, not by an invader, but by the sky itself. The desperation of this new reality is etched into clay. In the archives of the Hittite capital, archaeologists found letters that read not as royal correspondence, but as urgent distress calls. One, sent from the Hittite king to an Egyptian pharaoh, is stark in its need. It states plainly that there is no grain in his lands and that his people are suffering. The plea is for a life-saving shipment from Egypt's still fertile Nile. This was not a request between trading partners. It was the admission of a profound systemic failure. The Hittite Empire, centered on the arid Anatolian plateau, had always lived on the agricultural edge. Its prosperity depended on two fragile sources: the annual harvest from its own heartlands and the established emergency pipeline of grain from its southern ally. The prolonged drought shattered the first source completely. Fields that once yielded surplus now produced dust. Second source, the diplomatic grain supply, now became a tense negotiation over survival itself. Imagine the position of the Egyptian court, facing their own potential shortages and a world growing more unstable by the season. Sending a massive grain convoy north was no longer a simple act of friendship. It was a major strategic decision with dwindling returns. Would the grain be paid for with the now scarce copper or tin the Hittites could offer? Or would it simply be a gift to a weakening power? Every shipment became a calculated risk. This agricultural collapse did more than cause hunger in. It triggered a cascade of internal failures. A state unable to feed its population cannot maintain its authority. Local governors in outlying provinces, also facing famine, would have their own dwindling surpluses, leading to internal rebellions and a breakdown of central control. Most critically, an empire cannot pay or feed its army without grain. The Hittite military, the very instrument that secured trade routes and subdued rivals, began to atrophy. Soldiers would have deserted to find food for their families. The empire's grip on its periphery, those crucial buffer zones and vassal states that protected its core and facilitated trade, began to loosen and then slip away entirely. The Hittite crisis demonstrates how the first domino fell not on the battlefield, but in the granary. A climate event translated directly into economic scarcity, which eroded political legitimacy, which dissolved military strength. The strongest empire in Anatolia was being hollowed out from within, not by a foreign enemy, but by empty silos and unanswered letters. Its impending collapse would create a power vacuum of terrifying proportions, sending shockwaves through every connected kingdom. Into this landscape of failing empires and empty granaries came a force so infamous that ancient scribes recorded their arrival with a tone of apocalyptic dread. The Sea Peoples. Egyptian temple walls are carved with scenes of chaotic naval battles, showing warriors with plumed helmets fighting from sleek ships, their origins left ominously vague. For over a century, historians painted them as a mysterious, unified barbarian horde from beyond the known world, a sudden storm that swept the civilized order away. But what if we have the story backwards? The emerging picture suggests these sea peoples were not the cause of the collapse, but its most visible and violent symptom. They were likely not a single nation, but a complex, desperate mix of populations set adrift by the very systemic failures we have been tracing. Think of them less as an invading army and more as systemic refugees. As the Hittite heartland starved and its control shattered, coastal communities in western Anatolia would have found their trade links severed and their protectors gone. On the islands of the Aegean, the palatial centers of Mycenaean Greece were burning or abandoned, their complex economies in ruins. On Cyprus, the copper mines may have fallen into chaos. What options remained for the people in these regions? For fishermen and sailors whose traditional trade routes had evaporated, turning to raiding the still wealthy coasts to the south would have been a tragic, logical choice. For displaced farmers and soldiers with no lord to serve, hiring out as mercenaries to any remaining power or joining a roving band for survival became a means of living. The sea peoples, then, were likely a snowballing phenomenon. A group of displaced Anatolians might raid a coastal Levantine town for food. Survivors from that town, now themselves homeless and desperate, would join the group, lending their own knowledge of the sea or local geography. This growing, ethnic collective would move along the coast, a wave of human desperation feeding on the instability it helped to create. Their attacks were both a cause of further breakdown and a direct consequence of the initial one. A raid on a key port city like Ugarit in Syria, vividly attested in final, panicked letters found in its ruins, did not just sack a city. It severed another critical node in the network. Ugarit was a vital commercial hub, a place where Cypriot copper, Anatolian silver, and Mesopotamian goods were exchanged. Its destruction meant one fewer safe harbor, one fewer administrative center to coordinate trade, one fewer fleet to patrol the seas against piracy. Each attack accelerated the very conditions that had created the attackers in the first place, a vicious cycle of collapse. So when the remnants of these groups finally clashed with the armies of Pharaoh, the third in the Nile Delta, as the great carvings commemorate, they were not confronting an alien invasion force. They were facing the human whirlwind generated by a broken world, a final, desperate surge of populations pushed from their homes by famine, state failure, and the total unraveling of the system that once sustained them. The legend of the mysterious seafaring destroyers obscures a much harder truth. They were not the lightning bolt that struck the house. They were the fire, spreading from a structure already ablaze from within. The sea was no longer a highway, but a barrier. With every port city that fell to raiders or internal strife, another light on the maritime map flickered and went out. The most critical of these lights was the island of Cyprus itself. For centuries, the rhythmic sailings from its harbors had been as reliable as the seasons, a constant pulse of copper ingots moving out into the world. Then, the pulse stopped. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a stark and telling silence. The distinctive Oxhide ingots, once found in shipwrecks and palace storerooms from Egypt to Greece, simply vanish from the record. The mines at places like were not exhausted. They were abandoned, their galleries left dark, their smelting furnaces cold. This was not a gradual decline in production. It was a sudden, total cessation. The primary artery of the Bronze Age economy had been severed. Without a steady supply of Cypriot copper, the entire metallurgical cycle ground to a halt. Bronze, the very substance of civilization, became a finite resource. Kingdoms could no longer equip new armies with fresh weapons or tools. They were forced to recycle, to melt down old artifacts, to hoard every scrap. A society that cannot replenish its most basic industrial material is a society living on borrowed time, slowly consuming its own past. The loss of Cyprus was catastrophic, but it was part of a wider pattern of maritime failure. Look at the fate of Ugarit, the great trading metropolis on the coast of modern-day Syria. This was not a backwater. It was a commercial titan, a city whose wealth was built entirely on its ability to connect the inland empires with the Mediterranean sea lanes. Its archives, preserved in clay until the final days, capture the escalating panic. One letter, sent from the king of Ugarit to the ruler of nearby Cyprus, is a masterpiece of desperation. The king writes that enemy ships have been sighted, that his own troops and chariots are away on campaign with the Hittite overlord, and that the city is defenseless. He pleads for warning for any information at all. The reply, if it ever came, is lost to history. We know the city was burned to the ground, never to be rebuilt. The destruction of Ugarit was more than the loss of a wealthy city. It was the deletion of a crucial data hub. Think of it as a major internet exchange point going offline in a global digital network. With Ugarit gone, the smooth transfer of goods, information, and diplomatic messages between Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the sea became infinitely harder, if not impossible. The logistical knowledge, the trusted merchant families, the safe harbor facilities, all were erased in the fire. This cascading loss of ports and piracy's chokehold on the seas had a chillingly simple effect. It isolated every surviving kingdom into a lonely, struggling cell. Before the collapse, a local drought could be mitigated by grain shipped from a friendly, rain-blessed region. A shortage of tin could be addressed by sending a royal envoy to a trading partner. Now, with the sea lanes controlled by unpredictable raiders and the coastal in ruins, that was no longer an option. A crop failure was no longer a temporary hardship. It became a permanent, inescapable crisis. A region cut off from the tin trade could not make new bronze ever. Its technological trajectory simply stopped or even reversed. This isolation is the key to understanding why the collapse was so total and the subsequent Dark Age so profound. The system did not just break. Its individual pieces were then scattered, left to fend for themselves in a world that had suddenly become vast and dangerous again. The networks of mutual support that had defined the international age were replaced by a stark, local struggle for survival. The great kingdoms, built for interconnection, were now marooned on islands of their own territory, watching their resources dwindle and their options disappear one by one. The age of globalization had ended, not with a peace treaty, but with a deafening silence on the waves. Far to the west, in the fortified citadels of Mycenaean Greece, the silence from the east was a death sentence. The palaces of Mycenae and Thebes were not self-sufficient kingdoms. They were administrative hubs, the beating hearts of a redistributive economy that thrived on the very trade now collapsing. Their storerooms were meant to be filled not just with local grain, but with the wealth of the wider world, wealth that was no longer arriving. The Linear B clay tablets, their bureaucratic records, tell a story of meticulous accounting for every jar of oil, every piece of cloth, and every ingot of bronze. This was a system built for abundance and control, not for scarcity and isolation. When the tin shipments from the east ceased, the entire production cycle for new bronze weapons and tools stalled. When the flow of Egyptian gold and Mesopotamian glass dried up, the elite lost the exotic symbols that legitimized their power. Even something as basic as the grain supply may have been threatened. Some scholars suggest that the fertile plains of Greece itself were suffering under the same widespread drought, reducing local harvests at the very moment when imported food could no longer fill the gap. The palace economies began to starve, not just of food but of purpose. Their reason for existing, to centralize and redistribute goods within a thriving network, vanished. What followed was a predictable spiral. As resources dwindled, the social contract frayed. The ruling, or king, and his class of chariot-riding nobles could no longer provide for the skilled artisans, scribes, and soldiers who depended on them. Resentment grew. Archaeological evidence shows that around this time, many of the grand palace complexes were destroyed by intense fire. Notably, these fires often consumed the archive rooms where the Linear B tablets were kept. This is a critical detail. It suggests the destruction was not merely an accident or an external attack from the sea, though that likely played a part. It points to internal uprising, a violent rejection of the failing system by the very people it could no longer support. The burning of the records was an act of erasure, a symbolic end to the old order of taxes, quotas, and centralized control. With the palaces gone, the complex bureaucracy they supported evaporated. The knowledge of writing linear B was lost entirely for centuries. Specialized crafts like large-scale fresco painting or intricate sealstone carving disappeared. The population scattered, retreating from vulnerable coastal plains to smaller, more defensible hilltop settlements. The Aegean Sea, once a connective highway for Mycenaean traders, became a barrier and a source of danger. The loss of the Mycenaean world was a double blow to the collapsing system. Not only did it remove a major consumer of Eastern goods and a producer of prized commodities like olive oil and pottery, but it also unleashed a new wave of displaced, seafaring populations. Some of these may have swelled the ranks of the so-called Sea Peoples, adding their knowledge of the Aegean to the chaotic mix. Others simply vanished into a new, simpler, and way of life. The glittering age of heroes remembered in later epics like Homer's Iliad was over, replaced by a time of quiet villages and forgotten gods. The collapse had now reached its westernmost anchor, snapping another fundamental strand of the international web. The silence of the mines on Cyprus was not peaceful. It was the aftermath of a direct, devastating strike on the very heart of the system. This was not a slow decline due to failing trade. Around 1200 before the Common Era, the Copper Isle itself became and the archaeological record screams of a violent and sudden transformation. At the coastal city of, a major administrative and metallurgical center, archaeologists found a scene of utter ruin. Grand buildings were reduced to rubble, their walls toppled by immense force. Streets were littered with shattered pottery and the blackened marks of intense fire. Most tellingly, they uncovered hastily dug mass burials, final resting places for many individuals interred together without ceremony, a clear sign of a community overwhelmed by crisis. This pattern repeats across the island. At another vital port and metalworking hub, the destruction layer is equally stark. Here, the invaders did not just burn and leave. Evidence suggests they stayed, repurposing the sacred spaces of the old culture for their own use, signaling a complete and forceful change of power. Who these attackers were remains debated, but they are often linked to the same wave of seaborne groups that Egyptian records call the Sea Peoples. The critical point is their target. They did not raid a random village. They systematically assaulted the island's economic nerve centers, the ports and cities that managed the extraction, smelting, and export of copper. This was a strategic decapitation. By taking Cyprus, they were not just conquering territory. They were seizing control of the single most important industrial resource in the known world, or more likely, destroying the complex infrastructure required to produce it. The specialized knowledge was lost. The organized labor force of miners, smelters, and merchants was killed, enslaved, or scattered. The political stability that guaranteed safe shipment was obliterated. In one fell swoop, the steady, rhythmic production of Oxhide ingots ceased forever. Consider the technological impact of this single event. Bronze is not a permanent material. Swords bend and break in battle. Tools wear down with use. Agricultural implements need constant replacement. The entire era was defined by a cycle of consumption and replenishment, a cycle entirely dependent on that flow of raw copper from Cyprus meeting tin from afar. With the Cypriot mines silenced, the cycle stopped. Kingdoms could no longer replenish their stocks. Every broken plowshare, every shattered spear tip became a permanent loss. Societies were forced into a kind of technological scavenging, melting down heirlooms and art to forge essential tools, slowly consuming their own cultural capital just to survive. The siege of the Copper Isle was therefore the knockout blow to an already reeling system. It transformed the cascading failures in diplomacy, agriculture, and trade into a permanent, physical reality. No amount of diplomatic letters could restart mines overrun by invaders. No grain shipment could rebuild the expertise of a slaughtered guild of smiths. The keystone of the Bronze Age economy was pulled out, and the entire arch of civilization that depended on it came crashing down in a rain of dust and silence. A king's power is only as strong as the loyalty it can buy. In the gleaming courts of the Bronze Age, that loyalty was purchased with more than promises. It was secured through a visible economy of favor, a constant flow of exotic gifts, prestigious metals, and shared feasts that bound the warrior elite to their ruler. When the long-distance trade network shattered, this economy ground to a halt. The consequences were not merely economic. They were profoundly political, striking at the very legitimacy of every throne from Mycenae to. Imagine a Hittite noble, a commander of chariots, whose status was marked by a gold ring from Egypt and a fine bronze sword forged from Cypriot copper. For years, his loyalty was renewed with such tokens, proof of his king's far-reaching power and divine favor. Now the gifts stop coming. The royal storerooms have no new gold, no fresh ingots of tin, no rare lapis lazuli for ceremonial ornaments. The message this sends is unmistakable. The king has lost his connection to the gods of abundance. His magic is broken. Why should a local lord, who may still control a few productive valleys, continue to send his grain and his soldiers to a distant capital that can offer nothing in return but empty titles? This erosion of the gift economy created a crisis of confidence that spread from the top down. Without exotic materials to distribute, kings could no longer perform the most basic function of Bronze Age monarchy, rewarding service and displaying supernatural success. Their power, which had always been partially theatrical, now had no stage and no props. The practical effects were even more immediate. An empire cannot maintain a professional military without a functioning supply chain. Those Hittite and Mycenaean armies, with their expensive chariot corps and specialized bronze armor, were not just symbols of might. They were complex, fuel-hungry machines. Their fuel was grain to feed the soldiers and drivers, bronze to repair weapons and chariot fittings, and silver or gold to pay their wages. As trade collapsed, all three fuels vanished. A general facing a restive frontier province would find his troops underfed, their equipment deteriorating, and their morale crumbling. Local rebellions that might once have been swiftly crushed now festered and grew, because the central authority lacked the logistical means to project power over distance. The army, the ultimate enforcer of royal will, became a liability instead of an asset. Soldiers, unpaid and hungry, would have simply melted away, returning to their home villages or offering their services to whoever could provide a meal. The monopoly on force, that essential pillar of the state, dissolved. In this vacuum, new power structures emerged from the local level. Where a single great king once held sway, a patchwork of smaller chieftains and warlords now rose. These were men who controlled not vast international networks, but a single fortified hill, a critical mountain pass, or a still fertile river bend. Their authority was personal, immediate, and based on control of local resources, not on participation in a grand international order. The political geography of the Eastern Mediterranean shattered like a pane of glass, fracturing into dozens of smaller, insular pieces. The large, centralized palace and temple economies that required record-keeping and complex administration were replaced by simpler, smaller-scale systems. This is why the art of writing disappeared in Greece for centuries. The new local rulers had no need to track shipments of Cypriot copper or issue rations to a class of royal perfumers. Their concerns were local, their scale reduced. The Dark Age that followed was not simply a period of poverty. It was an era of political simplification, where the complex hierarchies of the Bronze Age gave way to a world of village headmen and regional strongmen. The vision of a unified, interconnected world under the guidance of brother kings faded into memory, replaced by a harder, more isolated reality where every community learned painfully to rely solely on itself. The great cities began to empty. This is the most visible archaeological signature of the collapse, a silent exodus written not in words but in layers of dust and decay. From the high citadel of to the coastal emporium of Ugarit, the urban centers that had been the engines of the Bronze Age world were simply abandoned. Their grand gates were left unguarded, their temple courtyards grew quiet, and their wide streets, once bustling with merchants from a dozen lands, were slowly reclaimed by weeds. This was not a temporary evacuation. It was a fundamental rejection of the urban experiment itself. The city, as an idea, had failed. Its survival had always been an illusion of interconnection, a delicate balance maintained by forces now vanished. Without the constant inflow of tin and copper from across the sea, the city's metalworkers had nothing to do. Their forges fell cold, their specialized skills becoming obsolete overnight. A blacksmith in a dying city cannot create bronze from thin air. He can only melt down what already exists, and when those last precious objects are gone, his profession, and the complex economy it supported, disappears with them. More critically, a city cannot feed itself. Urban populations had swollen on the promise of imported grain, the surplus from Egypt's Nile or Anatolia's plains shipped in to sustain administrators, soldiers, and artisans who did not farm. When those shipments ceased, the social contract broke. The choice became brutal and simple: stay in the stone-walled city and starve, or walk into the countryside and try to grow your own food. People walked. This mass de-urbanization was a retreat to safety, a return to the most basic unit of human society, the self-sufficient village. Life did not end, but it shrank dramatically in scale and ambition. The elaborate pottery styles, the intricate frescoes, the vast administrative archives, all of these were products of a concentrated, specialized urban culture with surplus energy to spend on art and bureaucracy. In the scattered hilltop villages that now dotted the landscape, such luxuries were meaningless. Pottery became simpler, cruder, and purely functional. Writing, the ultimate tool of complex administration and long-distance communication, was completely forgotten in regions like Greece for centuries. There was simply nothing to write about, no taxes to record for a distant palace, no trade invoices to send across the sea. The economic purpose of the elite had evaporated. What was a king or a high priest in a world without long-distance trade? Their power was built on controlling and redistributing exotic goods, on mediating between the people and the international order. With that order gone, their role was hollow. The palace, once the vibrant heart of the economy, became just a large, empty building, a target for resentment or a source of salvageable stone. The city-state model, which had defined political life for centuries, unraveled because its core premise was false. It promised security and prosperity through centralized control and external connections. The collapse proved that this prosperity was terrifyingly fragile. In the end, the stones were less valuable than a single, well-tended plot of barley. The true legacy of this deurbanization spiral was a profound simplification of society. The vertical hierarchies of the Bronze Age, with their god-kings, scribes, and specialized artisans, flattened into horizontal networks of farming communities. People traded with their neighbors, not with continents. They made tools from local materials, not from metals born of a global chain. It was a harder and far more local existence, but it was also resilient in a way the glittering cities never were. The age of monuments was over. The age of survival had begun, but bronze did not disappear overnight. In the smoldering ruins of the old world, a new metal slowly began to emerge from the fires, not as a chosen successor, but as a reluctant substitute. The common story tells of a rapid, triumphant march of iron, a superior technology that vanquished the old Bronze Age. The truth is far more gradual and born of desperation. Iron ore is indeed abundant, scattered in hillsides across almost every region, from Anatolia to Greece. The problem was never finding it. The problem was mastering it. Transforming a lump of iron ore into a useful tool or weapon was a technological puzzle of immense difficulty, one that the Bronze Age elites had little incentive to solve. Bronze smelting is relatively straightforward. Copper and tin melt at similar achievable temperatures. You combine them, pour the liquid alloy into a mold, and you have a serviceable object. Iron is a stubborn, trickier beast. To extract pure iron from its ore requires a much hotter fire, a blast furnace technology that simply did not exist at the height of the Bronze Age palaces. Early iron production, known as bloomery smelting, produced a spongy, impure mass called a bloom riddled with slag. This bloom then had to be heated and hammered, reheated and rehammered for hours to beat out the impurities and consolidate the metal. The result was often inferior to good bronze, being softer and more prone to rust. So why would anyone bother? The answer lies not in superiority, but in sheer, unavoidable necessity. When the tin trade vanished and the Cypriot copper mines fell silent, the choice was no longer between bronze and iron. It was between iron and nothing at all. A local blacksmith, cut off from the international metals market, could no longer order ingots from a faraway king, but he could gather nodules of iron ore from a nearby bog or hillside. He could build a simple clay furnace, and through trial and painful error over generations, learn to work this difficult local material. This was innovation not from a position of strength, but from a position of profound weakness. The adoption of iron was not a planned upgrade. It was a slow, grassroots adaptation to a broken system, a technological shift driven by isolation and scarcity. The great empires of the Bronze Age, with their centralized workshops and access to tin, had largely viewed iron as a curious novelty, a metal for ceremonial daggers given as royal gifts. It was the smaller, post-collapse communities, with no memory of reliable bronze supplies, who painstakingly developed ironworking into a practical craft over centuries. The age of iron did not cause the collapse. The collapse, by destroying the bronze supply chain, eventually made the age of iron possible. It was a technology born from the ashes of a globalized world, a hard-won solution for societies learning to live without the distant connections that had once defined them. One civilization alone managed to weather the storm, though it emerged from the tempest forever changed. Egypt stood, but it stood alone, a solitary survivor on a shore littered with wreckage. Its survival was not a sign of strength, but a testament to a unique, almost accidental, set of geographic and agricultural advantages that allowed it to endure what shattered everyone else. The first and most critical advantage was the Nile. While the kingdoms of Anatolia and the Levant withered under a prolonged, regional mega-drought, Egypt's lifeline was not the unpredictable rains of the Mediterranean. It was the annual, almost clockwork flood of the Great River, fed by monsoon rains far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands. This was a decoupled system. A drought in Syria did not stop the Nile from rising. The river brought water and rich, renewing silt to a narrow, fertile strip of land, creating a predictable agricultural surplus that could be stored in vast state granaries. When the Hittite king wrote pleading for grain, he was appealing to the one power that still had a reliable, internal food source. This agricultural resilience provided a buffer against the famine that hollowed out other empires. Egypt could feed its own core population and its army, maintaining the basic social stability that was crumbling everywhere else. The second advantage was one of simple geography. Egypt is a fortress defined by natural walls. To the east and west lie vast, impassable deserts. To the south, a series of cataracts on the Nile hindered major invasion from Nubia. The primary point of vulnerability was the north, the Nile Delta, where the river fans out to meet the Mediterranean. It was here, at this single, defensible gateway, that the final act of the collapse played out. Pharaoh III, in the 8th year of his reign, faced the converging desperation of the shattered world. The reliefs on his mortuary temple are not just propaganda. They are a historical record of a last stand. The inscriptions describe the chaotic movement of foreign lands conspiring in their islands, a clear reference to the displaced sea peoples. Did not meet them in the open sea or on foreign soil. He drew them into a trap at the river mouths of the delta, where his archers could rain arrows from the shore, and his navy could fight in confined, manageable waterways. He turned Egypt's geographic bottleneck into a killing field. The victory was real, and it saved the kingdom from immediate destruction. But this survival came at an almost unimaginable cost. The Egypt that emerged after the Battle of the Delta was a shadow of its former international self. The old world of brother kings and glittering gift exchanges was gone. There were no more Hittite allies to send letters to, no more Mycenaean traders bringing Aegean pottery. The great network had evaporated. In response, Egypt did not try to rebuild it. It turned inward, retreating behind its desert walls in a profound cultural and economic isolation. The state abandoned its imperial holdings in Canaan and Syria, pulling its military and administrative presence back to the Nile Valley. The vibrant flow of foreign ideas, art, and goods that had characterized the New Kingdom period slowed to a trickle and then stopped. Egyptian art and culture became more conservative, looking back to its own past for inspiration rather than outward to a now hostile world. The economy shrank from an international powerhouse to a largely self-sufficient, river-based system. This was not a choice, but a necessity. The cost of survival was the end of Egypt as a global player. It became a fortress civilization, wealthy in grain and secure behind its natural barriers, but disconnected from the wider currents of human innovation and exchange. It held on to its traditions, its language, and its gods with a fierce, insular tenacity, preserving a flame of the old world order while the darkness of a new age settled over the lands it once called brothers. The silence that fell was not merely one of abandoned cities. It was a deeper, more profound quiet, the silence of lost voices. In the wake of the collapse, the very systems of communication that had bound the great kingdoms together simply ceased to function. The intricate clay tablets inscribed with linear B in the palaces of Mycenae were baked in their final fires and then forgotten. Across Anatolia and the Levant, the use of cuneiform writing for international correspondence and trade accounting dwindled and then stopped in countless local centers. This was more than a loss of records. It was a collective amnesia, a communication blackout that descended over the eastern Mediterranean. The complex knowledge systems of the Bronze Age, from inventory management to treaty drafting, were not stored in libraries for later generations. They were living practices, sustained by a class of trained scribes who worked within the palace economies. When those palaces burned and their royal patrons vanished, the scribes had no one to serve, no goods to tally, and no distant kings to write to. The specialized skill of writing, which required years of training, became a talent without a purpose. In a world now focused on subsistence farming and local defense, who needed to record shipments of Cypriot copper that would never arrive, the knowledge was not outlawed or destroyed in a single act. It simply atrophied from disuse, fading away within a generation or two as the last masters of the script passed on without apprentices to teach. This loss of literacy is the defining feature of the period we call the Greek Dark Ages. For nearly 400 years, from roughly 1100 to 750 before the Common Era, the people of Greece left no written records whatsoever. Their history, their laws, their economic transactions all reverted to memory and oral tradition. The same pattern occurred, to varying degrees, in other regions. The great international dialogue conducted in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, fell silent. The constant flow of clay envelopes carrying sealed treaties and royal greetings between courts was replaced by an empty road. Think of the last panicked letter from the king of Ugarit, begging for news of enemy ships. After its sending, there was no reply, and soon, there was no one left who could even read the plea. The communication network died with the people and institutions that gave it meaning. This blackout was the ultimate cultural consequence of the supply chain failure. Writing had evolved not for poetry or history in its earliest forms, but for administration. It was a tool for managing complexity over distance, for tracking the dependencies that fed the system. When the long-distance trade in metals, luxuries, and grain evaporated, the complexity it managed evaporated with it. The need for the tool disappeared. Societies retrenched into smaller, simpler units where face-to-face interaction and spoken word were sufficient. The world shrank, not just in terms of trade routes, but in terms of imagination and shared identity. The grand narrative of a connected world under Brother Kings fractured into thousands of local stories, told around hearths in villages that knew nothing of the splendors of or the wealth of Thebes. What emerged from this long silence was not a direct continuation, but something new. When writing finally returned to Greece, it was not the old linear B of palace bureaucrats. It was a new alphabet, adapted from Phoenician traders, a tool for a different world. The voices that spoke again after the darkness told different stories, myths of a heroic past that only dimly remembered the true shape of the civilization whose collapse had made their own world possible. The physical proof of this great unraveling lies not in ancient texts, but in the silent layers of earth and the forgotten cargo of the sea floor. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, we must first look at a single, spectacular moment frozen in time. The shipwreck resting off the coast of Turkey is a perfect capsule of the world at its height. When archaeologists carefully excavated its remains, they uncovered a staggering inventory of interconnectedness. Here was a ship carrying 10 tons of raw copper from Cyprus, alongside precious tin ingots likely from Afghanistan. It held Baltic amber, Egyptian ebony, Canaanite jars filled with resin, and beautiful glass ingots from Mesopotamia. This one vessel was a floating microcosm of the entire system, a tangible snapshot of the globalized Bronze Age economy in full, vibrant operation. It represents the peak, the moment when all the threads of the web were strong and taut. Now, contrast that rich snapshot with the archaeological record from the decades and centuries after 1200 before the Common Era. The difference is not merely a decline, it is an erasure. The most telling absence is the complete disappearance of the distinctive oxhide-shaped copper ingots from Cyprus. For centuries, these ingots had been the universal currency of metal found in palace storerooms from Greece to Egypt. After the collapse, they vanish entirely from Aegean archaeological sites. No new shipments were arriving. The mines had gone silent, and the trade routes that carried their product were severed. This absence had a direct, material consequence on daily life. Archaeologists note a sharp decline in the quality and quantity of bronze tools and weapons found in settlements from this period. What bronze objects do appear are often smaller, simpler, and show extensive signs of repair and recycling. Communities were no longer making new bronze from fresh supplies of tin and copper. They were carefully curating and repurposing the existing metal, melting down heirlooms and broken items to forge essential tools. It was a society living on a finite, dwindling resource, slowly consuming its own past. The impoverishment spreads to every aspect of material culture. In the layers of earth that correspond to the post-collapse period, the artifacts tell a story of dramatic simplification. The beautifully painted, intricate pottery styles of the Mycenaean palaces give way to plain, utilitarian wares. The fine jewelry, the intricate seal stones, the exotic imports all but disappear from the archaeological record. The great cities, when they are at all, show evidence of a much smaller population living among the ruins of monumental architecture they could no longer build or maintain. The vibrant, cosmopolitan material world of the Bronze Age had contracted into a local, subsistence-level existence. The archaeological evidence does not show a conquest by a superior culture. It shows a profound forgetting, a loss of complexity and connection so total that it reset the trajectory of civilization for generations. The story written in the soil is one of a light going out, not from a single blow, but from the slow, inexorable dimming of every connected lamp. The final words of a dying world are not found in epic poems, but in bureaucratic memoranda. In the last days of the great Bronze Age kingdoms, the scribes kept writing, their styluses etching desperate reality onto damp clay. These are not stories of heroes, but urgent administrative messages, and they form a chilling paper trail of the collapse in real time. The most poignant come from the Hittite capital of. One tablet preserves a direct appeal from the Hittite king to an Egyptian pharaoh, a communication between brother monarchs that strips away all royal pretense. It states simply and starkly that there is no grain in his lands and his people are suffering. This is not a request for luxury or a diplomatic nicety. It is the raw admission of a state failing in its most basic duty to feed its population. The king is not commanding, he is pleading, revealing the terrifying vulnerability beneath the imperial facade. His empire's survival now hinges on the goodwill and surplus of a distant ally, a link in the chain that is already straining to its breaking point. Far to the south, in the bustling port city of Ugarit, the final letters capture a different kind of panic, one of immediate impending violence. The city's governor, a man named Hammurabi, sent a series of frantic dispatches. In one, addressed to the king of Cyprus, he writes that enemy ships have been sighted, a looming threat on the horizon. But the true depth of the crisis is in his next revelation. He states that his own troops and chariots are away, stationed in the land of the Hittites. His city, the wealthy commercial hub, is utterly defenseless. He begs for any information, any warning at all. The reply from Cyprus, if it ever came, has never been found. We know the city was burned to the ground shortly after. This letter is a snapshot of total systemic failure. The military support system between allied powers has broken down. The Hittite overlord, likely dealing with its own famine and rebellion, cannot spare forces to protect its vital trading partner. The sea, once a highway, is now a source of terror, and the networks of mutual defense have evaporated. The governor is not just reporting a threat, he is documenting his own isolation. Then, the archives fall silent. This silence is not an absence of evidence. It is itself the most powerful evidence of all. At Ugarit, at the Mycenaean palaces of Knossos, the layers of clay tablets simply stop. The meticulous records of grain shipments, the inventories of bronze ingots, the diplomatic greetings from foreign courts all cease at approximately the same archaeological horizon. The administrative hum of civilization, the written proof of its complex interactions, is switched off. This tells us the collapse was not a slow fade. It was a precipitous fall that rendered the very act of record-keeping meaningless. When there are no more grain shipments to tally, because the fields are barren and the trade routes are cut, the scribe has nothing to document. When there are no more foreign kings to write to, because their palaces are ash and their thrones are empty, the diplomat has no one to address. The intricate bureaucracy that managed the long-distance exchange of goods was not dismantled. It was made obsolete overnight by the reality it could no longer control. The transition from those desperate cries for help to the utter silence of the archives is the definitive record of the Cascade. We move from a world struggling to manage a crisis through its established channels to a world where those channels no longer exist. The letters are the sound of the system screaming in its death throes. The silence that follows is the sound of it gone. This textual blackout marks the true end of the Bronze Age international order, proving that the collapse was not merely political or military, but comprehensively administrative. The knowledge systems, the very protocols of communication that enabled a globalized world, were extinguished, leaving behind only fragments of baked clay and a mystery that would take to solve. Yet this story of total systemic failure is not without its puzzling contradictions. The collapse did not paint the entire eastern Mediterranean with a single, uniform brush of destruction. In fact, some cities along the coast of what is now Lebanon, places like Byblos and Sidon, weathered the storm. These Phoenician centers were not untouched, but they managed to hold on, and within a century or two, they would become the new masters of the sea, laying the foundations for a future network of trade. Their survival is a crucial complication. It tells us that the Cascade was not an inevitable doom that swept away every port and palace with equal force. Some nodes in the network proved more resilient than others. Perhaps their economies were slightly less dependent on the Hittite grain or Cypriot copper that failed. Maybe their locations offered better natural defenses, or their political structures were more flexible. Their endurance reminds us that human societies are not passive victims of systemic stress. They adapt, they pivot, they find new ways to persist even as the old order crumbles around them. The timeline itself resists a simple, dramatic climax. This was not a single catastrophic year where the lights went out everywhere at once. The process was staggered, unfolding over decades, perhaps even half a century. The Hittite capital of was abandoned before the final destruction of Ugarit. The palaces of Mycenaean Greece fell over a span of generations, not in a single season of fire. This drawn-out unraveling is consistent with a cascading failure, not a sudden invasion. It is the pattern of a network degrading link by link, where the collapse of one major player increases the strain on the survivors, until they too buckle under pressures they were never designed to withstand. Even the compelling climate evidence, the tree rings and lake sediments that point to a mega-drought, comes with its own nuances. While the data shows a profound and prolonged dry period across much of Anatolia and the Levant, its impact was not uniformly catastrophic in every single valley or island. Some regions may have experienced slightly more rainfall or had access to underground water sources that buffered the worst effects. This variation is critical. It means the environmental trigger did not act like a simple on-off switch for civilization. Instead, it applied immense and uneven pressure, exposing the weak points in the system. Areas with fragile, trade-dependent economies and poor local food security were the first to fracture. Those with more resilient local resources or alternative adaptations had a better chance of enduring the strain. These complications do not invalidate the cascade model. They enrich it. They show that the collapse was a historical process, messy and contingent, not a predetermined fate. The systemic vulnerabilities were real, the drought was real, the trade networks did fail. But within that broad, terrifying pattern, there was still room for human agency, for local variation, and for seeds of recovery to be planted even in the shadow of the fall. The story is not one of a light being switched off, but of a vast, intricate circuit overloading, with some filaments burning out immediately, others flickering for a time, and a few hardy strands managing to stay alight, waiting to illuminate a different world. This is where the story moves from a sequence of events to a profound historical lesson. The preferred explanation among many scholars today is not one of conquest or a single disaster, but of systems collapse. It is a model that sees the Bronze Age world not as a collection of independent kingdoms, but as a single, intricate, and deeply vulnerable network. Historians like Klein frame it this way. In times of prosperity, this interconnectedness was the source of unparalleled wealth and cultural brilliance. The long-distance trade in metals, the diplomatic bonds between royal courts, the shared artistic styles, all of these were signs of a sophisticated and resilient international system. But that same connectivity created a hidden fragility. In a network, the failure of one critical node can bring down the entire web, even if the original problem was local and small. Think of it like a modern power grid. A single substation failing in one city might cause a blackout across an entire region, because every community is drawing power from that same interconnected system. The Bronze Age world operated on a similar principle. Cyprus was not just an island, it was the primary substation for copper. The overland routes from Afghanistan were not just trails, they were the high-voltage lines carrying tin. The fertile fields of Egypt and the Levant were the power plants, generating the agricultural surplus that fueled everything else. For generations, this grid hummed with activity, and its interconnected nature was its greatest strength. A local shortage could be compensated for by a neighbor. A specialized skill in one region could benefit everyone. But what happens when multiple stresses hit that grid at once? This is the cascade. A prolonged drought, likely the first major stressor, did not just cause a bad harvest in Anatolia. It reduced the overall power output of the entire network. It meant the Hittite Empire, a major consumer and political stabilizer, began drawing more resources than it could contribute, straining its connections to Egypt and others. Then perhaps came seismic activity, earthquakes that damaged key ports or palaces, further disrupting local nodes. Internal rebellions born from that famine and strain acted like surges, overloading and burning out local circuits. Into this already flickering grid sailed the Sea Peoples, less like an external attack and more like a massive, chaotic power surge from within the system itself, a surge of displaced populations whose own homes had already lost power. The collapse was not the destruction of every single city by an outside force. It was the sequential failure of the network's most critical nodes. When Cyprus fell, the copper substation went offline. When the tin roots were severed, half of the recipe for bronze became unavailable. When Ugarit burned, a major distribution hub was deleted. Each failure increased the load on the remaining nodes, until they too buckled under pressures they were never designed to handle alone. Mycenaean Greece, dependent on that network for its prestige economy, collapsed inward. The Hittite Empire, starving and isolated, fragmented. Egypt, with its unique, self-contained power source in the Nile, managed to throw the main breaker and isolate itself, surviving but cutting its connections to a now dark and silent world. The system's collapse model teaches us that complexity has a cost. The very things that make a civilization magnificent, its far-reaching trade, its cultural exchange, its economic specialization, can also weave the threads of its own vulnerability. It was not the strength of the invaders that doomed the Bronze Age, but the profound weakness of a world that had forgotten how to live without its connections. When those threads were cut, the entire tapestry unraveled into 1,000 separate, simpler pieces. The darkness that followed was not an empty void, but the quiet of a system rebooting, learning painfully to generate its own light once more. For generations, the most compelling story was one of conquest. The elegant carvings on the walls of Pharaoh, the Third's mortuary temple, seemed to tell a clear and terrifying tale. They show chaotic naval battles, warriors with distinctive feathered helmets fighting from sleek ships, and piles of severed hands being counted as trophies. The accompanying inscriptions speak of foreign lands conspiring in their islands, their leaders making a league, and their hearts confident and trusting. This is the catastrophic invasion hypothesis, the idea that a unified, mysterious coalition of seafaring raiders, whom the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, swept across the eastern Mediterranean like a tsunami, burning cities, toppling kingdoms, and single-handedly plunging the world into a dark age. For a long time, this narrative fit the archaeological evidence of widespread, violent destruction found at sites from Greece to the Levant. It was a simple, dramatic explanation for a complex historical mystery, an external villain to blame for the fall of a golden age. The theory argues that these invaders, arriving in successive waves, overwhelmed the established powers. They sacked the coastal cities, cutting the vital maritime trade routes, and then moved inland, dismantling the great empires one by one. The synchronized burning of palaces and the abandonment of cities, from to Ugarit, could all be pinned on this relentless, mobile enemy from beyond the known world. It is a story of clear cause and effect, of civilization succumbing to a barbarian horde. This interpretation draws its power from those vivid Egyptian reliefs and the undeniable layers of ash and rubble found by archaeologists at so many sites dating to around 1200 before the Common Era. It presents a world not collapsing from within, but being murdered from without. Yet, for all its visceral appeal, the invasion hypothesis begins to fray when examined more closely. The first major weakness is the profound mystery of the invaders themselves. Who were the Sea Peoples? The Egyptian records list a bewildering array of names, but these names do not correspond clearly to any known homeland or unified culture from the period. They are ghosts. There is no archaeological trail leading back to a homeland from which this massive, coordinated force launched. No distinctive pottery style or settlement pattern spreads from a single point of origin to mark their path of destruction. They appear in the historical record fully formed as a threat, and then they vanish just as completely after their defeat. This absence suggests they were not a traditional migrating nation with women, children, and baggage trains, but something else entirely. The second, more critical weakness is one of logic and sequence. The invasion model assumes the sea peoples were the primary cause of the collapse, but what if they were, instead, one of its most dramatic effects? Consider the timeline emerging from the archaeological and textual record. The Hittite Empire was already in a state of severe crisis, pleading for grain, before the major wave of sea peoples activity described by the third. The Mycenaean palaces show signs of internal decline and conflict prior to their final burning. The climate data indicates a prolonged drought was already stressing agricultural systems for decades. In this light, the sea peoples begin to look less like an external cause and more like a symptom. They could have been a snowballing collection of displaced populations, refugees, and opportunistic raiders from regions already crumbling, from western Anatolia, from the failed states of the Aegean, from Cyprus in chaos. They were not a unified army invading a healthy world, but a storm of human desperation generated by a world already breaking apart. Their attacks would have then accelerated the collapse, severing the last functioning trade routes and destroying key ports, but they did not initiate the chain reaction. The final, decisive flaw in the pure invasion theory is geographic. It cannot explain the totality of the collapse. The sea peoples, as seafarers, targeted coastal cities and river deltas. Their reach was along the shoreline, yet the collapse was not just a coastal phenomenon, it was universal. The great Hittite capital of was not a port city. It was located hundreds of miles inland, on a high, rocky plateau in central Anatolia. It was abandoned, not burned by a seaborne raid. How did a coalition of maritime raiders cause the collapse of a vast interior empire that they never directly attacked? The same question applies to the interior regions of Syria and the Levant, far from easy reach of the sea. The invasion hypothesis struggles to connect the dots between a coastal raid and the total administrative dissolution of a landlocked superpower. A pirate fleet cannot starve an empire into oblivion unless that empire was already starving, its internal supply chains already severed. So while the carvings at capture a real and terrifying battle, they likely document the final, violent symptom of a disease that had already consumed the patient. The pharaoh was not fighting the cause of the Dark Age. He was fighting its feverish final crisis. This reframing is crucial, for it shifts our understanding from a story about mysterious destroyers to a far more cautionary tale about systemic fragility. The true enemy was not on the ships, but in the silent fields, the empty mines, and the broken threads of trust that once connected a world. The threads of this collapse were not separate tragedies, but strands of the same unraveling rope. It begins with the sky. A prolonged, regional drought settled over the heartlands of the eastern Mediterranean, a climatic shift that lasted not for a season but for generations. This was the first silent domino. Crop yields plummeted across Anatolia and the Levant, turning fertile plains into dust bowls and emptying the granaries that fed cities and paid soldiers. This agricultural failure triggered a human crisis. Hungry populations began to move, abandoning failing farms and putting immense pressure on neighboring regions that were themselves straining under the same dry skies. The stability that states had taken for centuries began to quiver. This environmental strain translated directly into political and military fragility. A kingdom unable to feed its people cannot command their loyalty. As famine spread, so did internal unrest. Local governors, facing their own starving communities, would have grain from the central authority. Rebellions flickered, challenging the power of distant palaces. More critically, a state cannot maintain a professional army without a steady supply of food and the metal to make its weapons. The great chariot corps of the Hittites and the infantry of the Mycenaean kings began to atrophy. Soldiers deserted to find sustenance for their families. The empire's grip on their frontiers, those buffer zones that protected trade routes, loosened and then slipped away entirely. The great powers were being hollowed out from within, not by a foreign sword, but by empty bellies and crumbling logistics. Into this landscape of failing states and moving populations sailed the phenomenon history calls the Sea Peoples. They were not a mysterious, unified army from beyond the map. They were the human consequence of the preceding chaos, a snowballing mix of displaced groups, opportunistic raiders, and desperate migrants from regions already in collapse. With the great empires weakened and distracted by internal crisis, these seafaring bands found opportunity. Coastal communities, once protected by the might of or the fleets of Mycenae, were now vulnerable. A raid on a wealthy port city was no longer a suicidal gamble, but a tragic calculation for survival. Each successful attack drew in more of the displaced, creating a growing, mobile force that fed on the instability it exacerbated. Their impact was catastrophic not because they toppled mighty capitals, but because they severed the vital veins of the system. These groups targeted the coastal hubs, the ports like Ugarit that were the critical nodes in the maritime trade network. With each burning harbor, the sea lanes grew more dangerous and eventually impassable. The steady, rhythmic sailings of merchant ships carrying Cypriot copper and Anatolian silver simply ceased. The distribution centers that coordinated the flow of goods were erased. This final, violent disruption of maritime trade was the knockout blow to an already reeling world. The interdependent economies of metal and prestige goods, which required constant long-distance exchange, ground to a complete halt. Without tin from the east, bronze could not be made. Without safe passage for ships, Egyptian grain could not relieve Hittite famine. Without the flow of gold and glass, the diplomatic bonds between kings turned to dust. The collapse, therefore, was not a single event but a cascade, a chain reaction where one failure triggered the next with escalating force. A climate shift led to harvest failure, which sparked social unrest and military decline. This weakness invited destabilizing migration and piracy, which then severed the physical connections of trade. Once those connections were cut, the entire sophisticated, specialized structure of the Bronze Age world had no way to sustain itself. It did not fall to a superior enemy. It consumed itself, its own magnificent complexity becoming the engine of its dissolution. The darkness that followed was the silence of a network going offline, one shattered node at a time. We can pinpoint the precise moment the cascade became irreversible. It was not the fall of a great capital or the clash of a famous battle. The point of no return was a silent, logistical failure, the sustained severing of two specific supply lines. For the palatial economies to function, they required a constant, parallel flow of two raw materials, copper from Cyprus and tin from the distant east. These were the twin arteries of the age, and if one was cut, the system could perhaps limp along, recycling old bronze, rationing its use, hoping for a restoration of trade. But when both arteries were severed simultaneously, and that severing lasted not for a season but for years, the body of the civilization went into systemic shock from which it could not recover. Imagine the palace workshops in Mycenae, or the master smiths are waiting. Their furnaces are ready, their molds are prepared, but the storerooms that should hold the shiny copper ingots and the dull gray tin are empty. A messenger might arrive with terrible news: the last ship from was lost to pirates. Another report says the caravans from the east have stopped coming, the mountain passes are closed. Day after day, the forges remain cold. This was the metallurgical heart attack. Bronze is not a single metal you mine from the ground. It is a recipe, an alloy, and without both ingredients you cannot make it. A kingdom might have a small stockpile of finished bronze objects, weapons, tools, ceremonial vessels. But weapons break in battle. Plowshares wear thin in the field. Without the ability to make new bronze, every loss is permanent. A society begins to consume its own capital, melting down heirlooms and art to forge a few essential blades or axles, a desperate and dwindling recycling that signals the end of growth. The military consequence was immediate and devastating. You cannot equip a new generation of soldiers with recycled scraps. A king's power rested on his ability to project force, to protect trade routes and suppress rebellion. That power was literally forged in bronze. As the supply dried up, armies shrank. Chariot corps, the elite fighting units that required constant maintenance and replacement of bronze fittings became impossible to sustain. The very instrument that maintained the state's monopoly on violence was dissolving, leaving frontiers unguarded and disgruntled provinces to their own devices. Economically, the paralysis was just as complete. Bronze was not just for swords. It was for the saws that cut timber, the chisels that shaped stone, the nails that held ships together. The entire infrastructure of production and trade depended on tools made from this alloy. As tools broke and were not replaced, the capacity for large-scale construction, for shipbuilding, for intensive agriculture all diminished. The complex, specialized economy of the palaces, which required precise division of labor and surplus production, could not function with a broken tool kit. It was like trying to run a modern factory while slowly losing all your wrenches and drill bits. Socially and politically, the message was unmistakable. When the king can no longer provide his warriors with proper weapons or his artisans with proper tools, his claim to divine favor and practical leadership evaporates. The gift economy, which distributed prestige bronze items to loyal nobles, ground to a halt. Why follow a leader who cannot furnish the most basic material of authority? The legitimacy of the entire palatial hierarchy, from the down to the local overseer, was built on the control and redistribution of these vital resources. Once that flow stopped, the hierarchy lost its reason for being. Local chieftains with access to a few remaining bronze objects, or who could rally men with simpler iron weapons, would have risen to fill the power vacuum. The prolonged break in the copper and tin trade did not just cause a shortage, it triggered an irreversible de-skilling. The knowledge of how to manage these long-distance supply chains, the diplomatic contacts, the shipping schedules, the standardized weights and measures, all resided in the palace bureaucracies. After a few years of silence, that institutional knowledge faded. The scribes who tracked the ingots were gone. The merchants who knew the routes were dead or dispersed. Even if a new source of tin were somehow discovered, the system to integrate it into the economy no longer existed. The networks themselves had atrophied beyond repair. Therefore, the point of no return was passed not with a bang, but with a prolonged, silent absence in the royal warehouses. When the ships from Cyprus and the caravans from the east failed to return, season after season, the brilliant but fragile experiment of the Bronze Age palatial economy reached its logical end. It had optimized itself for interconnection, not for isolation. Once truly isolated and stripped of the physical means to rebuild its complexity, it had nowhere to go but down. The darkness that followed was not merely a period of poverty, but a necessary simplification, a return to a scale where local resources and local solutions were the only ones that mattered. The world did not end, but it was profoundly and permanently reset. For nearly 4 centuries, the lands that had once hummed with international commerce and royal correspondence entered a period often called a dark age, a long twilight where the scale of everything contracted. Populations were smaller, settlements were simpler, and horizons shrank from the span of continents to the view from a village's protective wall. This was not a pause, but a fundamental. The grand, top-down palace economies were gone, replaced by a patchwork of smaller, more resilient units that had learned a hard lesson about the dangers of overdependence. In this new, quieter world, the glittering globalization of the Bronze Age would not be repeated for a very long time. Instead, a different kind of order began to emerge from the local soil. Along the coast of what is now Lebanon, cities like Tyre and Sidon, which had managed to endure the worst of the collapse, found their new purpose. With the great empires inland either gone or diminished, these Phoenician centers turned their gaze entirely to the sea. But they were not trying to rebuild the old network of bulk copper and grain shipments. That system had proven too vulnerable. Instead, they pioneered a new model of trade, one built on agility and highly specialized, high-value goods. They became the master craftsmen and distributors of the Iron Age, famous for a single, extraordinary product, a vibrant purple dye extracted from sea snails, a color so rare it became synonymous with royalty itself. Their ships, smaller and more versatile than the great cargo vessels of the Bronze Age, did not follow the old, rigid routes between imperial capitals. They became explorers of opportunity, establishing trading posts and small colonies across the Mediterranean, from Cyprus to North Africa to as far west as Spain. This was a decentralized, entrepreneurial network, less about supplying the needs of a palace and more about connecting markets for luxury items, metals, and crafted goods. It was trade rebuilt from the ground up, with a built-in caution against putting all its eggs in one imperial basket. In the Aegean, a different kind of political innovation was taking shape. From the scattered villages of the Greek Dark Ages, new communities slowly coalesced, not around the figure of a divine king in a fortified palace, but around a shared civic space, the agora. These were the polis, the independent city-states like Athens, Corinth, and Sparta. Their scale was intentionally limited, their economies focused on local agriculture and regional exchange. While they would eventually trade and colonize, their primary loyalty was fiercely local, to the city and its citizens. The memory of the collapse, preserved in myth as an age of fallen heroes and lost grandeur, may have ingrained a deep suspicion of over-centralization and distant, fragile dependencies. Their strength came from internal cohesion, not from a vast web of external alliances that could snap. Meanwhile, in the interior of the Levant and Syria, another significant shift occurred with the rise of the states. Their power was not based on massive armies or copper mines, but on control of the caravan routes that still crossed the land. Cities like Damascus became hubs for overland trade, but it was a trade conducted in a new international language, Aramaic, which gradually replaced the old Akkadian of the Bronze Age diplomats. This was a practical, bottom-up solution for communication between smaller kingdoms, a lingua franca for merchants and administrators that spread not by imperial decree, but by sheer usefulness in a fragmented world. What united these diverse successors, the Phoenician sailors, the Greek citizens, and the caravan masters, was a shared, unspoken inheritance of risk aversion. The new systems were designed to be more fault-tolerant. They were modular. The failure of one city-state did not necessarily doom its neighbor. The loss of one trading post did not collapse the entire Phoenician network. This was a world that had internalized the trauma of the Cascade. It chose to build connections, yes, but connections with circuit breakers, with a primary emphasis on local resilience first. The brilliant, brittle interdependence of the late Bronze Age, with its god-kings and Oxhide ingots, had been a spectacular, but ultimately unsustainable, first experiment in a globalized world. Its dramatic failure taught humanity a difficult lesson about the hidden fragility of complex systems. The civilizations that grew in its shadow did not seek to replicate that specific model of grandeur. They built something different, something more decentralized, more adaptable, and in its own way, more durable, setting the stage not for a unified international order, but for the clashing and blending of diverse classical worlds that would follow. The collapse of the Bronze Age world is not a closed chapter. It is a stark, ancient blueprint of a pattern we know all too well in our own time. Our modern world is built upon a network of far more vast and intricate than anything the Hittites or Mycenaeans could have conceived. We do not trade in Oxide ingots carried by a single ship, but in a constant, global river of container ships, data packets, and financial transactions. Yet the underlying architecture of vulnerability remains hauntingly familiar. We have constructed a brilliant, efficient, and breathtakingly complex system, one that delivers unprecedented prosperity, but is also wired for cascading failure. Consider a single, recent example, the global semiconductor shortage. A modern computer chip is the tin of our age, a hyper-specialized component without which countless industries cannot function. Its production is a miracle of globalization. The design may come from one country, the specialized machinery from another, the raw materials from several more, and the ultra-precise manufacturing might be concentrated in just a handful of facilities on the entire planet. This is peak efficiency, but it is also peak fragility. When a drought in Taiwan, a primary manufacturing hub, threatened the water-intensive chip-making process, the entire chain shuddered. The shortage did not just mean you had to wait longer for a new game console. It idled automobile factories across continents, delayed medical equipment, and slowed the production of everything from smartphones to home appliances. A localized environmental event in one region became a global economic event, echoing the ancient drought that starved the Hittite heartland. The COVID-19 pandemic provided an even more comprehensive stress test. It was a systemic shock that touched every single node of our global network at once. When one major port slowed due to health measures, the delay rippled across the world's shipping lanes, creating floating traffic jams of cargo ships and leaving store shelves empty. When factories paused, the just-in-time inventory systems that modern businesses rely on, systems with no buffer for disruption, snapped. A health crisis rapidly cascaded into a logistics crisis, a manufacturing crisis, and an economic crisis, demonstrating how our lean, interconnected systems can amplify a single problem into a universal one. We watched as the failure of one link, whether a port, a factory, or a trucking route, threatened to stall the entire machine, much like the fall of Ugarit severed a critical artery for the Bronze Age. The lesson here is not that globalization is bad, any more than the Bronze Age international system was inherently bad. Both represent humanity's incredible drive to connect, specialize, and prosper. The lesson is about the hidden tax of complexity. Every connection, every increase in efficiency, every step toward greater interdependence also introduces a new point of potential failure. The Bronze Age world discovered this the hard way. Its kingdoms optimized for prosperity in a stable climate, with reliable partners. When the climate shifted and partners faltered, their specialized roles became traps. They had forgotten how to be self-sufficient. Our modern challenge is to learn from their archaeological record. We must recognize that the very things that make our world rich and convenient, its deep specialization and just-in-time logistics, also make it brittle. Resilience is not the opposite of efficiency, it is its necessary partner. It means building buffers, diversifying suppliers, and sometimes valuing security over sheer cost saving. It means understanding that a shock to the energy sector, the financial system, or a key shipping lane does not stay in its lane, it floods the entire network. The ghosts of an Ugarit whisper a timeless warning across that no civilization, no matter how advanced, is immune to the cascade. Our task is not to dismantle the web we have woven, but to weave it with a stronger, more redundant thread, ensuring that when one strand inevitably breaks, the whole tapestry does not unravel. Yet for all we have uncovered, the fall of the Bronze Age remains an unfinished puzzle. Scholars still debate the precise sequence of that final, fatal cascade, weighing each factor against the others in a historical balancing act. Was the prolonged drought the primary trigger, or did it merely weaken kingdoms for a political and military collapse that was already brewing? Did the movements of the sea peoples deliver the killing blow to a dying system, or were they themselves the most visible symptom of a disease that began elsewhere? The exact origin points of those seafaring groups remain one of the great enigmas. Were they displaced populations from western Anatolia, from the failing Mycenaean world, from the islands of the Aegean, or a combination of all these places? Without a clear homeland in the archaeological record, their story is written only on the walls of Egyptian temples and in the ashes of the cities they attacked, leaving their true identity shrouded in the smoke of the collapse itself. Adding another layer of complexity is the potential role of natural disasters beyond the drought. Geological evidence suggests a period of heightened seismic activity in the eastern Mediterranean around this time. Could a series of major earthquakes have crippled key cities, damaged vital port infrastructure, and shattered the morale of populations already under stress. A powerful quake might explain the sudden, violent destruction at some sites, but it cannot account for the widespread, systemic unraveling across regions unaffected by tremors. The debate continues over whether earthquakes were a coincidental aggravating factor or a meaningful contributor to the domino effect. To answer these questions, historians are no longer relying on clay tablets alone. Modern science is providing powerful new tools to peer into this ancient crisis. Advanced paleoclimatology, using everything from deep-sea sediment cores to mineral deposits in caves, is refining our picture of the drought. Scientists can now analyze the chemical signatures locked in ancient stalagmites to reconstruct rainfall patterns year by year, revealing that the dry period may have been even more severe and patchy than previously thought, with some areas suffering catastrophic aridity while others held on a little longer. This granular data helps explain why some cities, like those in Phoenicia, endured while others vanished. Another groundbreaking technique involves isotope analysis. By studying the unique chemical fingerprint of metals, researchers can now trace a copper ingot back to the specific Cypriot mine it came from, or a tin artifact to its original ore deposit, perhaps in Afghanistan or even farther afield. This is like putting a tracking device on ancient trade goods. It allows us to map the rise and fall of specific trade routes with incredible precision, showing exactly when the flow of metal from a particular source dried up, providing a tangible, chemical timeline of the economic collapse. These tools are turning speculation into data, but they also reveal a world more complicated than any single theory can explain. The collapse was not a tidy equation with one variable. It was a perfect storm, where environmental stress, economic fragility, political instability, and human movement converged. The ongoing research does not seek a simple villain, but a deeper understanding of how interconnected systems behave under extreme pressure. Each new discovery, whether from a cave in Israel or a laboratory spectrometer, adds another piece to the mosaic, reminding us that the story of the Bronze Age is still being written, its final lessons still emerging from the dust. The true tragedy of the Bronze Age was not a single fire, but the failure of the entire circuit. We have traced the cascade from its silent beginning, a prolonged drought that emptied granaries and strained loyalties, to its devastating end, the total severing of trade routes that left kingdoms isolated and starving. A climate shift triggered agricultural collapse, which in turn hollowed out political authority and military strength. This weakness invited destabilizing movements of people, whose raids then shattered the remaining maritime links. With the flow of copper and tin cut off, the technological foundation of the age crumbled, and with it, the complex palatial bureaucracies that had managed this intricate web. What began as an environmental stressor in one region amplified through every connection, until the entire system fragmented into simpler, isolated pieces. This was a textbook example of complex systems failure, where interdependence, once the source of unparalleled wealth, became the engine of total dissolution. The story of the late Bronze Age collapse is a powerful reminder that no civilization, no matter how brilliant or advanced, is immune to the cascade. Our own world, bound by digital threads and global supply chains, echoes with similar vulnerabilities. The past does not repeat, but it often rhymes. If you found this journey into ancient systems fascinating, the exploration is far from over. Consider diving deeper with books like Klein's 1177 BC, or watching documentaries that explore how archaeologists and scientists are piecing together this pivotal turning point in human history. The collapse of the Bronze Age world is more than a historical mystery. It is a timeless lesson in the delicate balance of our interconnected lives.